Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Athanasios Ellis. I'm the editor-in-chief of Kathimerini's English edition. And I welcome you to this really timely Kathimerini Forum. A free press is, I guess we all would agree, a pillar of democracy, and democracy is being challenged these days, if not under attack, and not only in faraway third world countries or from autocratic regimes, even closer at home. We see that the values, the democratic values, are being challenged. The press is being under pressure in a lot of countries. And in this context, this discussion will take place. We at Kathimerini feel that we do serve the public in the sense that it should be served from the press. Quality journalism is a must, especially these days of fake news and propaganda. And the fact that our English edition is published as a joint venture with the international edition of the New York Times, I think speaks volumes, and of course places a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. In that context, this discussion will take place, but before we go to the discussion, I would like, and it would be my honor, to ask Achilles Tsaltas to join us and share some thoughts on how the Athens Democracy Forum began, something that has been an institution. It's been very successful, and actually it was with us the last couple of days. So, Achilles, please. That's it. Or
yeah, well. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. This is the concluding event for this year's 10th Athens Democracy Forum. And it's quite appropriate because this is where it all started with Kathimerini. And I will tell you a little bit about the story behind Athens Democracy Forum. But first, just to give you a little bit of context, it is the 10th. It was founded in the International Herald Tribune, which a few months later became the International New York Times. And a couple of years ago, we decided that in order to make this forum more consequential, we had to take it out of the commercial structure of the New York Times and build a non-profit. And that's how the Democracy and Culture Foundation was born, which is now the organizer of the Athens Democracy Forum, but always in association with the New York Times. And in fact, the three journalists here, Roger Cohen is the host of Athens Democracy Forum. You were there at the very first one. Then Liz Alderman and Stephen Erlanger joined us, and you've been there ever since. So how did it all start? You know, Alexis Papachelas, the editor at the time of Kathimerini English edition, Nikos Konstantaras, we were discussing how we were going to celebrate our 15 years, our 15-year anniversary between IHT and Kathimerini. And Alexis, I think it was, or Nikos, we were talking about a function, and then Alexis and Nikos said, democracy is under pressure. And I caught on to that for some reason. I don't know why, but we started, I thought we'll do a global conversation on democracy under pressure. That was 10 years ago. It was a 2-hour event at the Stoa of Apostolos. This is the 4th day, I think, of I've lost count, of this year's Athens Democracy Forum, which continues tomorrow and Sunday. So from 2 hours, we've gone to 6 days. I believe it has become an institution. It is one of the most important events, I believe, for the New York Times in its calendar. All our journalists are there. All the programming is behind this. You talked about a free press and truth. That is the DNA of the New York Times. And by extension, that's the DNA of Athens Democracy Forum. And every year, unfortunately, it becomes more urgent and more relevant. But we hope that the conversations that we have, and now with the foundation putting more focus on the doing part rather than the thinking and the talking. We believe you need to think, you need to talk, but you need to do. With the foundation part, we listen to what people tell us at the conference, and we try and turn those solutions into action. So thank you for being here. This is an attempt to open it up to the broader community as well. Enjoy the conversation this evening, and hope to see you at Athens Democracy Forum next year. Thank you, Alexis Papachelas, Themis Salafouzos, Tom, Ellis, for the partnership over the last decade. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you.
So in order to answer the question if it will be the toughest year in Europe this winter, it's a very heavy title at least. Three great journalists from the New York Times and our own Alexis Papachelas from Kathimerini, and of course they will, and Liz, and Mr. Doxiadis, a very well-known author here in Greece, and not only in Greece. The discussion will be moderated by our own Iliana Magra, so Iliana, please join us, and please, all of you.
Thank you very much, Tom and Achilles, and welcome all. And it's a pleasure to have you all on stage with me. This is Cohen, the Paris Bureau Chief of the New York Times, Stephen Erlanger, the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, Liz Alderman, the Chief European Economics Correspondent for the Times, author Apostolos Doxiadis, and Executive Editor of Kathimerini, Alexis Papachelas. So without further ado, there's the war in Ukraine. Inflation in the Eurozone has hit a record high. That was actually announced today. The energy prices have skyrocketed. There's a far-right resurgence in Italy and Sweden. What are we to expect this winter, Roger? Is this the worst that Europe has faced since the end of World War II?
I don't know about that. I don't want to stray into hyperbole, but it's certainly a very rough period ahead through the winter. I don't see how it can't be that. We are meeting here today and speaking on the day that President Putin in Moscow is announcing the annexation of 40,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory in the east and south of the country, 7 months after his totally unprovoked invasion, with the result that all that territory is now part of the Russian motherland. And Putin has made clear that all means, and we know what that means, it includes tactical nuclear weapons, will be used to defend the motherland. So in theory, from now on, if Ukraine pursues its offensive against Kherson, for example, in the south, that could be the riposte. I don't think President Putin would move to that extreme readily, but nor do I think we're now talking about nuclear war in Europe. You know, we haven't spoken about that throughout my lifetime, which now goes back quite a long way. But people talk about it, and you can't get hold of the anti-radiation tablets and other things in pharmacies in Paris. So this has become part of our lives. It's funny, actually, I was talking to a businessman this morning, and he said to me, in terms of the economy and investments, you know, we weigh various things, but when it comes to nuclear war, you just go on spending and doing whatever you were going to do, because if there's nuclear war, then all bets are off. So that's one element, and I don't think it should be completely discounted. I mean, maybe here in Greece there's more focus on the bellicose acts of Mr. Erdogan, but I don't think that should be discounted. And then, as you said, Iliana, there are all the economic crises looming. Inflation in Germany went over 10%, and we know what high inflation does to the German psyche. It brings back very, very, very bad memories. And In France, the government has spent a lot of money trying to keep energy prices down, but there's a lot of upward pressure, and that's throughout the continent. We've already seen demonstrations in the Czech Republic, smaller one in France. And in the face of that, will European unity hold? I mean, I should state that I do think that right now, the war in Ukraine is the front line of a battle to preserve democracy in Europe. I think if Putin has its way, if Putin has a victory in Ukraine, if the West somehow crumbles, if NATO's resolve evaporates, that's a little bit end of story. I don't know, what purpose after that NATO would necessarily serve. So I think it is an absolutely critical battle, and it's been engaged now. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Steve, in which point in its history do you think that the European Union is right now?
Oof, well, put it this way, it's an experiment, it's always in flux. I think you're seeing a change in the balance of power. It's been happening for a while. It's shifting to the east, not just because of the Ukraine war, but in part because of the Ukraine war. There's a kind of feeling in former Soviet-occupied countries, many of which still border Russia, that the rest of Europe has been complacent. It's been sleeping through the Putin period. After all, Nord Stream 2 was started a year after Crimea was annexed, right? I mean, Nord Stream 1, okay, but Nord Stream 2, 2015. The Germans, the view is, certainly from Poland, took their own national security interests above Europe's interests, certainly above Poland and Ukraine's interests, to allow Putin to blackmail Eastern Europe while he continued to deliver gas at high prices to Western Europe. Yeah. But nobody wanted to hear that. So now people are hearing it. And you also have, a rule of law problem, which persists, which everyone knows about. It's not getting much better. I mean, Hungary is a little country, so, I mean, in a way, you can kind of isolate it. But if you add in Poland, which has actually been more resistant in some ways to the rulings of the European Court of Justice than Hungary has ever been, and Poland's big, and then you add in a Brothers of Italy government in Italy, you at least have the potential of a Eurosceptic group inside the European Union that is powerful. And the European Union works by consensus. Even if you have various majorities, you still need consensus. So I'm not worried about previous sanctions being abandoned, let's say against Russia, but I am a little bit worried about new sanctions, though I don't think Europe has a lot more sanctions to deliver, quite honestly. This has become in Ukraine, I mean, it's really an American-supplied war. I mean, the European military aid has been declining fairly quickly, partly because of stocks and partly because they're worried about having the minimum requirement needed if NATO should be invaded, which I don't think is going to happen, but who knows. And, they've done pretty well with stocks of gas and so on. We'll see what happens when the oil embargo swings. It's an important topic here because of shipping and transport and insurance. It's a big deal. I'm worried more about next winter in Europe than this winter, because this war is clearly not going to end anytime soon. As Rogers just said, when VV Putin declares sacred Russian territory in areas of Ukraine it hasn't even conquered yet,
yeah.
It implies at least the war is not about to end.
So you think that a year on from now, there might still be a war in Ukraine?
Oh yes, I'm sure of it. I hope I'm wrong, of course, but that's my prediction.
And I do have one more follow-up question. But Meloni is not pro-Putin, and she's pro-Ukraine. Yeah. So if she leads the Italian government and she's poised to become the next prime minister, how could that affect the sanctions?
I don't think it will affect the sanctions, but you know, a third of the new Italian parliament, a third, comes from parties with very ambivalent views of Moscow and Putin.
Yeah.
Right? Plus her two coalition partners, don't forget. I mean, Berlusconi used to have a blanket with Putin's face on it that he used to sleep under. You know, the bunga bunga birthday parties with Putin, his best friend. Salvini's been very Moscow-leaning. Now, she can control, you know, she has more seats than them. But I think Italian popular opinion is, it's ambivalent.
Yeah.
It's ambivalent. So I think it'll be okay. I don't think she wants a fight with Brussels over money. She's, Brussels, in the next 2-3 years, will be providing 10.5% of GDP to Italy in COVID recovery funds.
Yeah.
So I don't think she wants a fight. But one can see more pressure in Europe for what the French and Germans have been pushing, which is more of a diplomatic solution, than continuing the war.
Yeah.
And that's a debate that's ongoing, I think.
Thank you. Liz, we've already mentioned the record high inflation rate in the Eurozone, and which has been fueled by the increasing energy prices in part. How do those numbers and those increasing rates translate for the average European citizen? What does this mean, you know, for their quality of life?
Well, I mean, it certainly means more pain ahead, more pain than what a lot of European citizens have already been feeling. And, you know, the backdrop to the geopolitical kind of whirlwind that we're seeing right now that Steve and Roger just described is a coming, I think, much worse financial whirlwind. And we've already started to see that cresting. Inflation had already been starting to rise somewhat in the wake of the after pandemic lockdowns had been lifted. And then along came Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as you know, that has had the effect of driving energy prices into the stratosphere. The result of that has been that households across Europe have been increasingly squeezed. We had already started to see inequality unfold. Very well known here in Greece. I covered the Greek economic crisis, the Ochivot, and all of that. People were very worried that Greece would come out of the Eurozone. That didn't happen. But, you know, the pain that people here felt in terms of the drop in standards of living is in some ways repeating itself, and even possibly worse across Europe. And governments have been spending huge amounts of money to try and blunt some of that pain. France, for example, started spending hugely, actually last winter, because one of the concerns is that that we could start to see more social uprisings come of this. We had the Yellow Vest movement in France. There was a big concern even 1 year ago that this type of movement could start to break out again, not only in France, but in other European countries. And so a major effect of the situation in Ukraine, having inflamed the energy prices, food prices further, is that it has rippled, you know, throughout, obviously, Europe, but also we're seeing in the United States, in Latin America, governments having to respond in ways that are increasing, you know, debts and deficits. And at some point, governments, you know, have a limit as to how much they can spend on social stability. And so, you know, one of the phrases that we heard a lot at this year's conference is that winter is coming. I think, as Steve said, it's definitely not going to be a hard winter only this year, but possibly next year and the year after that. I mean, just one more thing that I would add is that this is happening at a kind of a head-spinning rate, and that's when things get very dangerous. Somebody was just saying to me earlier today that in the UK, We've all seen the kind of disaster that's been unfolding there. People were talking about Grexit 10 years ago. Now, actually, Brexit has happened, and Britain has suddenly tumbled into a situation that's arguably just as bad as, and potentially worse, than what had happened here. And, you know, this person was telling me that all of a sudden, their mortgage rate spiked, you know, £200, you know, within just a matter of a few days. And this is happening all over the place, including in the United States, where the Federal Reserve has jacked up interest rates quite massively and is likely to continue to do so. The European Central Bank also has been doing the same and has also, you know, fueled this to some extent, to a great extent, arguably, by having, you know, flooded Europe with money previously to try to take care of some of the emerging problems. So I think we're in for a really very possibly nasty financial, again, whirlwind or even tsunami, if I could use that term, at the same time that will be accompanying the geopolitical tension, and the two will sort of feed on one another. And that, I think, doesn't bode well for the near future.
I find it interesting that you say that Brexit is arguably worse than what Grexit would have been, because I don't think that it has translated in that way in the collective consciousness, but that's just my opinion. And
fair enough. I mean, pensions there were not slashed, you know, by a troika that has, you know, been trying to push, you know, austerity on people. We don't have people in the UK lining up at ATMs, for example, as they were here, you know, a decade ago. You know, that being said, it is happening so fast. Clearly, the government's actions that we've seen just in the last week have been calamitous. They're continuing on that course. You might possibly, I mean, British people that I talked to just this week said, we're not sure how long this government is going to last. Yeah. More instability, more debt. That just adding to the problems that we already had doesn't point to at all a positive future for the average British person.
We should remember that Brexit was supposed to solve all Britain's problems.
And more, and make it better.
Global Britain, panacea, everything perfect.
300.50 million a week for the NHS.
Yeah. Where is Boris Johnson these days?
He has visited Greece since he resigned. Holiday. Apostole, as Liz said, Greece not that long ago came out of a very painful financial crisis. And now that, to use again Liz's words, that we're expecting a financial whirlwind, how do you think that people might respond to that? And do you think that democracy in Europe, and maybe even Greece specifically, is robust enough to fight off a new financial crisis?
Well, I don't think anyone is robust enough to fight off any financial crisis, but within the limits and the reasonable expectations we have seen, I would think so. And, you know, speaking about democracy, you know, I love the title itself. It's a good title, good graphics too, with the stars and the clouds. But I tend to be very weary of analogies with the Second World War.
You see some sunshine in the horizon? Or?
Not really. Though I'm by inclination an optimist. Right? But, you know, this time, you know, and as Steve and Liz said, it's not about the year. You know, it's the first time that they say the analogy may have a point, because there's actually a war, you know, around the corner or on our doorstep or inside Europe, depending how you would, if, you know, Ukraine counts as Europe or not. It's not in this classical sense, but in the present political sense, but it is in many other ways. And certainly by our borders with it and our affiliation with it, our sympathy and our support with it. So I would say that, you know, the metaphor does make some sense. And if Steve and Liz are right, and it's not about a year, you know, the metaphor leads us to at least 5 years of war, if it's like World War II. And that too could make sense because, you know, this is not so much a year that's strange as a change of an era, possibly. a final end of the sort of post-World War II Western Europe and post-total Europe, post-1989 optimism and joy of it's over, the end of history and all that. No, history has not ended, and it's coming back in cycles. We see deep polarizations in many countries that do remind us of older times. We see them affect the political life and political system. I'm not an expert on economy, and having Liz here, I'd feel like a fool talking about it. But regarding the politics, you know, I think there is a cleavage in Europe now, as we see the worst possibly coming, hopefully not. And I tend not to worry so much about changes that we see in most countries of Western Europe as being bringing on something much worse, something looking like a dictatorship or whatever, God forbid, fascism or something. Whereas I tend to worry much more about countries of Eastern Europe, or what we used to call Eastern Europe, or even if you're an arch conservative, the Iron Curtain. I think that what comes there, and it's a very Greek concept in a way, is some sort of historical fate in those countries, not in a metaphysical sense, but our past is not letting us go. And I think a way a country will deal with this crisis or crisis now has to do a lot with its past, which means also a lot with its institutions and how robust they are. It's not about now, it's not about the fluctuating contemporary political scene, but how deep are the institutions and structures that could prevent the worst. So, for example, like Steve, I don't worry about Italy. You know, I think Meloni will be tamed by the system and the inherent instability of the Italian political system. She'll probably count a year, 2 years, and then it'll be a new thing. And, you know, I think if she stays on for 2 years, she'll break a record or something. And,
do you worry about Greece?
Well, you know, we were born to worry about Greece as Greeks, but not more than I worry about Europe. No, I think I worry more about the fate that we shall share as Europeans. But regarding political institutions, I mean, if, for example, in Western Europe, I worry much more about France. And there, because we have the same polarizing structure, because of the presidential system, because whoever rules has to have 50%, as in America, for that matter, and that does tend to support extreme solutions. So in Greece, no, because of our political system, not so much. But and there you see, you know, except I worried only once, not even with, or not with Syriza really, although I was definitely not for the government, but with the referendum, the OHI you mentioned. And that was because, and there's a big irony there, the very institutions that are built to prevent, to have to be the ultimate checks and balances, to prevent a sort of distortion of the system from democracy to something else, have been seen in recent decades to turn against that very stability. For example, the Supreme Court in the United States, or Brexit, or the Greek referendum. Suddenly you have a referendum, popular rule, direct democracy, what's more beautiful than that? And suddenly you see those institutions which our countries are unprepared for. You know, any country other than Switzerland does not know referendums, and those great democratic things are suddenly the worst for democracy because we are not prepared for them. So I think, no, I'm not worried about Greece to the extent that more so than about any other European country. I think we can absorb the shock.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. So, Alexis, do you think that Turkey's aggression towards Greece could evolve into something more than a mere war of words? And is this a challenge that to not just Greece, but Europe in general that maybe the Europeans should be more worried about than they are now?
Okay. First of all, allow me to say just a couple of words about our three colleagues. We're very thankful that you're here today with us. I mean, Roger's columns we miss, I have to say, but apparently a collection of those will be published in February, right? So,
You're right.
And Stephen's reporting, which is good old reporting, really shines and proves that there is, you know, a future for good journalism. And Liz always has done journalism with empathy. Actually, she covered the Greek crisis with so much empathy that she married a Greek. She met during the crisis. So,
One good thing came out of the Greek crisis.
You know, the role model of empathy. I think Turkey is a challenge. But of course, nobody should look at Turkey in a kind of, you know, just as a momentary picture. There's a big debate that we should have. I think we want a Turkey which is predictable, which is stable, and which has strong ties to the West. And the question is whether this is possible and whether we need more tough talk, you know, towards Turkey, or more affection, as the Turks always, you know, try to claim that, you know, that's what they're looking for. I actually think that the West has done a mistake. I think there should be a bit more clear-cut about their warnings towards Turkey. I am worried about Turkey. I'm very worried about the fact that Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus are having election cycles at the same time, and I think this is a very bad coincidence, in my opinion. And I also see that Turkey's president is very desperate in terms of the domestic pressure. And, you know, when somebody is desperate, you always have to sort of look out for, you know, what's going to happen. So yes, I am worried, and I think that this could be a critical moment, because if there's a serious crisis between Greece and Turkey, I think there will be a lot at stake. In my opinion, Greek public opinion will turn against the West if it feels betrayed at such a moment of truth. And I think that's something that, you know, every decision maker in the West should keep in mind. I mean, the picture we look today, which is a great honeymoon between the US and Greece and Alexandroupolis and all this, could really turn upside down within 24 hours. This is a country where the wind blows in different directions in the morning and in the evening. It happens very often.
Were you more worried during the summer of 2020 about Turkey's aggression than you are now?
Well, in 2020, we came very close. As you remember, there was a collision between two ships, and it took a lot of self-discipline on both sides to control the crisis. But now, what worries me is it's the first time that I see the Turks really raising the rhetoric to such an extent. And when I see Erdogan and the press and everybody else climbing the tree, I always worry about how you climb down. And also, I'm very worried about the opposition playing the game. I mean, we see this in Greece all the time, but now this has become a Turkish national sport. So I'm worried about it.
Yeah. Do you, Roger, think that Europe has made a mistake in its handling of Turkey, especially in relation to Greece and maybe Cyprus?
Well, you know, it's a measure of how consumed the United States and Western Europe and the eastern part of Europe are with the Ukraine issue, that the Turkish-Greek issue does not impinge very much on the day-to-day news cycle. That said, you know, Turkey and Erdogan it's a problematic member of NATO. The arms deals with Russia, the provocations toward Greece, Erdogan's transformation of Turkey into another illiberal society, more or less on the Orban model, with an emasculated judiciary, control of the universities, firing of a lot of independent journalists or imprisonment of them. Yeah, Turkey's very problematic. I would be astonished if a way was not found to climb down from the tree. I know we're living in a moment of unthinkable things. I mentioned all the chat about nuclear war, but Greece and Turkey starting a little war, I don't think so. I think a way has to be found out of that. I think the United States would deploy all its energy and resources to head off such an outcome. Both countries are important to the United States, and that would be something I think that the Biden administration would work very hard to avoid. Yeah. I think it's amazing the way Greece. I mean, the bounce back here in Greece has been pretty extraordinary. It's a country with a lot of. I was always struck by Greece's humanity toward the refugees, despite one or two pieces in my own newspaper. I thought, in general, the attitude of the Greeks, the generosity of the Greeks, confronted by that situation at the same moment as a huge economic crisis, was pretty remarkable.
Well, not that I represent Greece, but being Greek, thank you for your kind words. Steve, after the Trump presidency, and now we're 2 years in the Biden presidency, how do you think that the role of the US in Europe has changed? And do you think that it's likely that it might change again in 2 years if the Republicans get the presidency?
Good question. I do want one thought, though, about Greece and Turkey. What worries me is the French-Greek Mutual Defense Treaty. That could spark something really serious. It's one of the reasons I think the Americans want to make sure nothing happens. To have a war inside Europe with allies, I mean, you know, it would be quite a moment. Obviously, Erdogan...
2 wars would be a lot.
I mean, obviously, Erdogan's desperate. Yeah. He could lose this election, though people in Turkey say, how can he lose the election? Because he'll sort of manage it. But he's, you know, the economy is a wreck. His economic policy is terrible. And he has earned some, how would you put it? I mean, his mediation in Ukraine has bought him space from criticism, both from the US and from the EU. So I think the danger is he takes that too seriously. Okay, so now I'll answer what you asked me.
No, but it was a very important point.
No, but I mean, I'm very worried about Turkey.
He's consulting with Trump on how to win a lost election.
That's right, exactly. You know, what hangs over everything in Europe is Trump broke the credibility of the consistency of American foreign policy. I mean, it used to be, in general, you know, we fought each other at home and we had a fairly consistent foreign policy abroad. And Trump broke that, and he broke it in Iran. Yeah. So how could anyone really trust the US's word after that? And you see it in Europe because the bounce back, normally in Europe, the polls, people love Democrats and hate Republicans. It's just the way it goes. You see it all the time. It's in Germany, it's in Greece, it's everywhere. They loved Obama, they hated, I mean, you know, they loved Clinton, they hated Reagan, blah, blah, blah. But the bounce back for Biden is not as big. There's much more mistrust of American leadership, partly because of our tarnished democracy, to be blunt, because of our polarization, because the Republican Party has gone off into a kind of Trump acolyte status, at least for now. A Republican Party that knows it's a minority, so is trying to suppress voter participation quite openly. So if America's the mirror for democracy, that's been tarnished. And also, I think Afghanistan was not a big moment for American leadership, but they've handled Ukraine pretty well. And then this is very frustrating for Mr. Macron, who saw Trump as a great opportunity for Europe to act on its own, to build up its defenses, to to behave as a real power. I think the Biden election was actually a bit of a disappointment to Macron. He was not very generous about Biden winning.
He still hasn't visited the White House.
No, exactly.
And he's not talking about European strategic autonomy very much these days.
No,
So.
but even in this film where he was, you know, talking to Putin and so on, never, America's never mentioned. I mean, it's really, so the worry is, and I actually think Macron's probably right, that Europe should do more for its own defense, and it shouldn't rely on America so much, and it should have its own policy toward China.
Is doing this now, right? They're spending $100 billion on defense.
They've promised.
What does this mean for the future?
They've promised to do it, but it's not going to be 2% a year, and it's shaky because German friends at the beginning, when the war started, it was a great shock to them. They thought, oh my God, war's coming to us. This 30 glorious years of peace are over. There's war in Europe. We always thought peace meant Russia as part of our security structure. That's no longer true. It's coming here. But now German friends say, oh, no, it's okay. The Ukrainians have done well. It'll stay in Ukraine. So it's a bigger ambivalence in Germany now than there was when Scholz first made his speech. So all I'm saying is I don't know what's going to happen in 2024. I'm not sure Trump's going to run again. I don't know. I'm sure Biden will run again if he's walking and talking and breathing.
Could Trump be re-elected if he ran?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a hard.
Unlikely.
The way the system's organized, he certainly could be the Electoral College. I don't think it would happen. Democrats who are in the party, you know, in the wheelhouse of the party, say to me they'd like to run against Trump. It'd be easier to win, they say. I think they underestimate how good a politician Trump is. I mean, this guy's got a visceral sense of what drives people. He's I mean, I shouldn't say this in public, but the guy's a demagogue. He's really good at it.
I think Roger disagrees with that, right? I mean, you don't think Trump...
I disagree with that. You were joking, of course.
No, I mean, you don't think Trump is going to be re-elected, right? I mean,
I thought you were saying I don't think that Trump is a demagogue. I most certainly do, and many other things that I'll refrain from saying right now, maybe. I don't think Trump will win again. You know, the number of times one has said this time it's too much and been proved wrong with Trump is a warning. But I think you know, January 6th, what's going on now, Mar-a-Lago, the rise of some alternatives in the form of DeSantis, especially, you know, signs of dissent and fracture to some degree within Israel. That said, as Steve said, he's you know, he has his own political genius, so malevolent genius, and he surprised us once. I don't think it'll happen again. I mean, that's my gut feeling, and my gut feeling in 2016 actually was that he would win. So, who knows if my gut feeling is worth anything? But,
I would go to Apostolos before I go to Liz, and I'll ask you, do you think that is it necessarily a bad thing that during Trump's years, the US influence in Europe wasn't as strong?
The US?
Influence in Europe.
Well, I think that's, if it was not in the old ways, which were more direct, okay? It was like Steve said, for Macron as a reaction to that. Definitely not. And I would only make a little parenthesis here that I heard, I think it was Steve say, or maybe Roger, that we stopped this kind of good influence, stopped with Trump. I'd say it had started a little earlier, much as I liked Obama, emotionally at least. And there were disappointments in his years for all of us who thought it was great news that he was coming, that he didn't go as far as we hoped, and he went back in some things, including this. I think we can see it, for example, in Afghanistan, or how it started under him. So I think, when Roger said, I was very, there was a part of what Roger began with, this second turn of comments, made a statement, a part of which I loved and a part of it I disagree with. He said, Turkey and Greece having a little war, no, America would not allow that, if I get it approximately right. So I think he was wrong in the first part. Well, sorry, I think so. I think Greece and Turkey could have a little war. You said little
How
war,
big?
sorry. Little war.
How big?
Little.
In what sense?
A little in duration, in temporal duration. But I was very...
1,000 dead? 500? 500 dead? 1,000 dead?
No one did?
I don't count it in dead, I count it in days. I mean, who am I?
Well, in wars, people die.
Sorry?
In wars, people die.
Well, if it's a few days, it will be a few dead, but, who am I to judge by the number of dead people? But, no, I think because what Alexis referred to in 2020, this collision of two ships, what in Greece we constantly call about the accident and its complications. And if one is looking for an accident, the more one of the two sides is looking for it, as Turkey is now, the more likely it is they'll get it. And one gets out of the accident with a tiny war if you want. But I was very relieved to hear the second part of your statement. No, America won't allow it. And if I may paraphrase or recall Robert Duvall's comment in Apocalypse Now when you said there's no chance America will intervene, that smelled like victory. Robert Duvall said, I'd say it smelled like peace. It reminded me, carried the whiff of the good old days of American interventionism, which were very, I would say, on the whole, benevolent for Europe. I have some hope with Biden. We see its signs that spirit is there. And we hope it will last. And if we are going to have a little war, I do hope we have it under Biden and not under the next guy. And, again, you know better, but America. But
Roger, you want to say
one thing I wanted to say. You used this word accident. I've been thinking about
one we use.
I've been thinking about the word accident quite a lot. We just had an accident in which two gas pipelines got blown up, sabotaged, not clear yet. Some people think Russia, some people think the United States. And we had some discussion, I don't remember who was mentioning World War II, but I've been thinking much more about World War I, because I don't know if you've read Clarke's book, The Sleepwalkers, but I feel at times these days that we're sleepwalking towards something terrible. The world went in 30 days from the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo to the outbreak of World War I and 15 million dead. And it was also a time then of empire fading, rising powers, shift in the balance of power in the world, multilateral, unpredictable forces. And I feel there is the possibility, one can imagine all kinds of scenarios right now of an accident and of all of us sleepwalking towards something that goes out of control.
An accident that could lead to a world war?
Well, that could lead to a radical escalation involving, say, Putin deciding enough of the arms deliveries, I'm going to hit the airports in Poland. And I have French friends who say they believe if that happens, the United States and NATO would not respond if there were no Americans killed. Wrong, in my view. I think NATO and the United States would respond, would be obliged to respond, and if they don't, that's the end of NATO. So then where are you?
You agree, Steve?
Well, I do, and then we'd be in the world that Jeffrey Sachs wants. No, I don't think Putin will touch NATO. I think this he understands. And I think NATO has done a pretty good job, because part of what I do is cover NATO, of taking more seriously deterrence, building up deterrence. It's been quite remarkable, and NATO has big debates inside, which it keeps quiet, but basically it's held together very, very well. And I think seeing what Western weapons can do on the hands of Ukrainians, I think the Russians are going to be very careful about touching NATO. The question is, which is a different question, NATO's defending itself, but should it be doing more for Ukraine if, as Roger says, the Ukrainians are fighting a war for all of us? And there are lots of other questions that we haven't answered, like how does the war end, and how much does it cost, and who ends it, and what does victory mean, and what is,
who pays for the
can Russia lose? And these are questions policymakers don't even want to
Can Ukraine
talk
lose?
about.
Yeah.
But as far as NATO's concerned, again, I may be wrong, but I don't think Putin wants to dare.
The
NATO.
involvement of NATO.
Can I ask Stephen who detonated the pipelines, who blew up the pipelines?
I don't know.
I'm not trying to detonate the discussion, but I really
I don't know. I mean, personally, who knows? Personally, I just can't see Russia blowing up its own pipelines. What's the point? It's invested 20 years and $20 billion in building the pipelines.
But who has the capability to do it then?
If you ask the question, cui bono, who does it benefit?
Yeah.
It
benefits
I mean,
Ukraine.
you can. That's what I mean by you can turn it a lot of different ways.
I mean, I talked to my friend Radek Sikorski the other day, and all he wanted to say on the record was, well, for the Polish government, these pipelines have been a big issue with Germany for 20 years. We've hated them. Allow me to be overjoyed that they've been blown up, and I prefer to think our allies did it rather than our enemies. Who knows?
But
who knows?
If I may, on that, on the pipeline, Roger, you said the use of the word accident perhaps is very culture specific in Greece regarding Turkey. You said the pipeline was an accident in terms that we didn't expect it, yes.
Well,
but it
between
was
an accident and an incident.
It's a deliberate.
But it was a willful act by somebody.
Yeah.
Here, we mean by accident the fact that, for example, there are 20, 30, 50 dogfights a day with Turkey.
Yeah.
And if those get to 100, even statistically, it's very possible that one will lead to some poor pilots of both sides being dead. And if they are dead, and if that is perceived of as war or as an excuse for war, what happens? So we live on that margin, on that fringe.
Liz, back to you. If the war doesn't end, and it lasts for at least one more year, how does the energy crisis end while the war continues?
Well, I did want to say something about the pipelines and the question of who benefits.
Of course.
I mean, we don't know, obviously, yet exactly who blew it up, but who benefits from that? Arguably, Putin does, because a big part of his strategy with the war in Ukraine and also with this energy crisis has been to try to sow division in Europe. And one of the ways of doing that is to obviously sort of, create conditions that hit, people in their pocketbooks, but also sow psychological fear. When I was in Ukraine last month reporting, one of the things that really struck me was that although the Ukrainians were very, had a huge amount of solidarity, had obviously come together to fight, this common foe and to fight, for their freedom. At the same time, I was in the West, so I was not in the bombed out areas, but, in that, even there, people are living in sort of, a kind of a constant state of psychological terror and psychological sort of uncertainty. And that's what we're seeing, being sown across Europe once again with this energy crisis. And, just these images that we've seen in the Baltic Sea of the gas pipelines, gas sort of coming up, it frightens a lot of people. And people have already been asking, ordinary citizens, voters have already been asking, our European leaders here are banding together and sticking together and, you know, supporting Ukraine in this war. Why should we do that if we're the ones that are paying the price? And I think that's one of the main things that Putin is counting on, is to sort of sow division from the inside, from the citizens themselves, against what their leaders are. Yes, I mean, yes, exactly. We've already seen protests, as Roger pointed out, in the Czech Republic. You know, protests, again, kind of broke out, all right, small ones, yes, you know, in France. And again, as I said earlier, it's sort of governments that are kind of buying this peace, at least temporarily with subsidies. But, you know, governments can only subsidize, you know, household electricity bills so much. At some point, even with the subsidies, it's too much for some people to afford. Where does the energy crisis, how does it end if this war goes on? I mean, certainly in the short term, another kind of little bomb, I guess you could say, that Putin has left for Europe has been to force countries to go back to burning fossil fuels at a time when Europe had been making a lot of progress on its climate change goals, the 2030, 2050 goals. Here in Greece, for example, Greece has been moving heavily into green energy, et cetera, but as I understand it, you know, plans, for example, to close lignite mines, those have been postponed. Even in France, which is Europe's main sort of nuclear energy producer, okay, there's a bit of a crisis there because half of the massive fleet of 56 nuclear power plants there are offline because of problems. But even a country like France is having to go back to using coal-fired, you know, plants. And so this is all, and we've also seen that France and Germany have struck a deal where Germany has decided to reverse a decision to close the last of its nuclear power plants in order to basically keep, you know, the power on. And so France and Germany are going to be exchanging electricity and gas. And at the same time, you know, we're already starting to see the effects of this with factories in many countries. You know, France, Germany, not Norway, but Denmark, for example, steel mills. You know, people are being put back on furlough again. And, you know, these furloughs could wind up turning into kind of long-term job losses. So at the same time, obviously, the energy crisis has created a massive geopolitical shift where Europe is starting to, you know, rapidly building more LNG terminals. France is getting closer to Algeria, which is obviously of interest because it's a gas supplier. Qatar, the United States, all supplying LNG. In the short term, that's meant to help, you know, bridge this gap. But over the longer term, it creates also these new sort of, you know, geopolitical conditions. And, you know, Europe's solution, or what we hear from Brussels, we heard Ursula von der Leyen, you know, speaking last night at the STOA, reaffirming, you know, Europe's commitment to its green goals. But it's going to be much more expensive and much longer to get there. And in the meantime, you're going to have households feeling the pain a lot, and then possibly fueling more of the political movements, you know, that we've been seeing, that we've been talking about on this panel.
Thank you very much, Liz. And one very quick question for Alexis before we open it up for 10 minutes for questions to the audience. Ursula von der Leyen said during her State of the Union address earlier this month that these are going to be a few not easy months ahead. Is there a glimmer of hope? I mean, what we've been talking about doesn't paint a very pretty picture. Is there anything that we should be hopeful for?
Well, I think the Greek experience shows you that you have to be optimistic about Europe. I think Europe has a way of solving its problems through consensus, even at, you know, when things are getting very, very, very bad. I think the European people are, you know, they're very aware of their history, I think, still, which is very unlike the US or other places. So they're very afraid to repeat mistakes of the past. At the same time, of course, what worries me is a lack of leadership. I see very, very few strong leaders around Europe. And that's, I think, a real problem. And if I go back to the original question that you asked Roger, where are we now? I mean, for me, this period reminds me a bit of, the 20s and the 30s. I mean, it's more like Weimar. You have a huge financial crisis. You don't have fights in the streets, but you have them in the Twitter sphere and the social media, and this toxic polarization. You have this incredible delegitimation of any kind of pillar of authority, which is happening very fast. And you also have a world order which is, begging, is open to a lot of changes. I think that the status quo is not really sustainable. I think the big fight, actually, it's not between Russia and the West. The big fight is going to be within the West, in my opinion. I mean, what Putin will try to do is tire out the West through financial pressure. He knows that he can create havoc through the social media, through the economic pressure, and so on. And I think the big challenge is whether the West will be able to keep itself together and to fight, the courage to fight this war back and not let the jungle grow, as they say.
So a wish, not a reason for hope. But still, we'll take that.
Listen, I became very bipolar during the Greek crisis because I used to wake up in the morning and I thought everything was done. And then in the evening I was saying, well, we're okay, we're going to survive. So it's very difficult for me to say this. I mean, and also I keep referring to the Greek example because I was telling my French friends, for example, that if France had done what we did in terms of reforms, pension cuts and all this, there would have been a Bastille Day ×3. And now it's their time to do their thing. So let's see how they do it. And Germany will go through the same thing as well, in my opinion.
Agreed. Do we have any questions? I see one here from Mr. Ellis.
Actually, two quick ones. First of all, you mentioned, both Steve and Roger mentioned that there might be an attack in Poland or somewhere else, and then NATO might respond, might not. Are we talking possibly about a potential use of tactical nuclear? And given the clouds in the background, that makes the question more.
Yeah, I can't see them. I can only imagine them.
And second question, maybe for the rest of the panel, does it make a difference, especially what Alexis mentioned about the division within the West, that we don't have a different quality of leaders? You don't have a Delors, you don't have a Mitterrand, you don't have a Kohl, you don't have a Tony Blair, to mention just the European part.
Go ahead. I think in terms of escalation, although I mentioned the Polish scenario, I think the more likely scenario is now that these 4 areas have been absorbed into Russia, it's quite likely that Ukraine will make a concerted attempt before the winter comes on, to recapture Kherson, for example, in the south, which was one of the first major cities to fall in the war and is close to Crimea. Now, if that were to happen, how would Putin respond? We don't know. There have been some small attacks on Crimea already that went largely unanswered. So I think that's one possible scenario. But then, of course, there are accidents. I mean, there are things that could happen. Could a rocket land just over the Romanian border? Could all kinds of things happen? And if indeed, and I tend to agree with Steve, the war is going to go on for another indefinite period. I covered the war in Bosnia, which ended after 3.5 years, and it ended, like most wars, in substantial part because both sides were exhausted. I think we're a very long way from exhaustion in this particular conflict. Putin thought it would be a walk in the park, and that he would just drive straight into Kyiv. And it didn't happen, and now he has a different kind of war on his plate. And I think he's right when he says he's not only fighting Ukraine, he's fighting... I mean, we are doing everything short of putting soldiers on the ground, right? So everything short. I mean, the support of Ukraine is massive. But I don't think we can... I think there's an assumption, because it's been going on for a while now, and it was here in our minds, and it gradually recedes because our lives seem to continue more or less as normal. There's an assumption that it's under control. I think that's a dangerous assumption.
And Steve, do you want to talk about leadership in Europe?
Well, I think Roger's answer is quite a good one. I mean, the one question I do have I'm not a military expert, is what is the military advantage of Russia firing a tactical nuclear weapon? It would just bring more severe consequences. I mean, again, I don't know about the pipeline, but one could interpret the pipeline as a response to Putin's "I'm not bluffing," as a sort of warning about what could happen if he does such a thing. Again, I don't know, but it has a logic to me. Leadership, yes. I mean, it's an old, there was a British essayist called William Hazlitt in the 19th century who had this wonderful line. He said, "We no longer have great portraits because we no longer have the faces for them." and I think of that when I think of...
Just look at this panel.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's astonishing to me. You know, we all love Merkel, and her legacy's been collapsed in 6 months.
Could we do a quick vote in the room? Who thinks it was Russia? Who thinks it was the US? Who thinks it was someone else? I mean,
That blew up the pipeline.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it.
Davai.
Who thinks that Russia blew up the pipelines itself?
okay.
And who thinks it was the US? Okay. It's a clear majority.
And you didn't ask someone else.
There's nobody from the US Embassy here. You can expect it. It's not there.
I think the answer is...
I wouldn't be
we
so
don't
sure.
know.
That is probably. Yeah.
I think the answer is we don't know. Yeah. I mean, but it's a funny thing. So,
But how would it work? Were they set there way before, you think? I mean,
Yes.
the explosives?
I don't know. I mean, I think the explosives were put down before. Yeah. I mean, and it would have to be fairly sophisticated. You'd need submersibles. I mean, it's pretty deep. And these pipes are pipes within concrete, within pipes. They're meant to withstand tides and, I mean, you know, it's a pretty serious effort. And they did leave one pipeline unblown. One of the Nord Stream 1 pipelines unblown. So who knows? I just think one could interpret it as a message. I mean, no one will ever take responsibility for it.
A message to Putin or to Europe?
A message to Putin.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, he's invested a lot in these pipelines. He cut off the gas by turning a valve. He didn't have to destroy his own pipelines. I just can't see it. Who knows? Just very briefly about leadership. Macron wants to be the leader, but he tends to march and look around and there's nobody behind him. Right? Because people mistrust him still. They think when he talks about Europe, he's really talking about France. And when he's talking about defense, he's talking about French defense industry. You know, it's kind of inevitable. I think there is a vacuum in Germany. I think there are worries with Italy. I mean, you know, these are the big three, right? So
What about
it is
the
a
role
problem.
of Ursula von der Leyen? Because she has...
Well, she's got very good,
become more-
she's got better speechwriters now. It was quite a good speech. But I mean, how many divisions does the European Commission command?
I think you're a little unfair to Ursula von der Leyen.
Yes, I am.
I think she's been quite a considerable figure, and I think maybe Tusk was... No, she's really, I think, emerged as a serious European leader. And her State of the Union, whoever listened to the European State of the Union, I feel like when she made that speech the other day, it actually impinged on Europeans' consciousness to some degree. So I think you're a little harsh on her, Steve.
Fair enough.
Liz, on leadership or anyone?
Do we have any more questions?
Sorry, could I say a
I'm
few
sorry.
words about leadership, Tom's question? I think that, you know, the names you mentioned that we don't have now, and tying this with William Hazlitt's comment, one does tend to look down more about one's contemporaries and see greatness in the past. So I'm not saying those leaders you mentioned were not great, but I think that partly, without discounting the personal factor in history, they were also children of their times. It was the second, let's say, post-World War generation of European leaders, and the agenda was clearly there to take Europe and their countries forward. Leaders today are elected usually with a much more conservative agenda to either try to salvage what is there or to avoid prevent the worst from happening in the future. So in a sense, it is a less visionary age. It's a more conservative and scared, if I may say, age. And so it is natural to have leaders that look like they measure up to that standard. So I don't know if they're greater or not as potential, but I don't think they'll have a chance to show us either.
Churchill was leading Britain during the World War, during World War II.
By accident.
Yes, but still, I mean. Okay, we'll take one more question.
Thank you for this. What I wanted to ask is whether any of you think that there is any space or any scope or any role for the UK in all of this. I mean, it's a country with great institutional memory. However, it's still acting in every move like a developing country. Take the charming example of the lowering of the tax rates across the tax base, supposedly to assist the increase of the disposable income of the households. I mean, has it rendered itself irrelevant through all of this by being consumed time after time in internal affairs? Or will we see a UK at some point soon in the immediate future having some role and scope in all of this?
Some role in?
Scope.
Right.
Steve?
Just very quickly, I mean, I've spent 9 years of my life there. It's a great country. It's still a big economy. It's a member of the Security Council. It's a crucial part of NATO. And as the Estonian defense minister once said to me, the British Army may be small, but they like to fight. So I wouldn't underestimate them. I mean, Liz Truss is kind of, I mean, I was joking the other day, Rishi Sunak, who warned against all this, was Cassandra in a suit, right? Because what's going on now is quite extraordinary. I suspect it will balance out, but she is been harsher against Putin even than Boris has been. She imagines herself in some ways as a Thatcher-like figure. I think the UK will continue. It's been very generous in terms of military aid. Ben Wallace remains Defense Secretary. I think it is not irrelevant at all, and it's a very important part of the alliance in support of Ukraine.
Liz, do you want to add anything?
King Charles apparently has big ambitions.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, I would generally, agree with Steve that, don't count the UK completely sort of, down and out. They are still a great power, maybe arguably not as great of a power as they were, just, even 5 years ago or whatever. But it's true that certainly in the short term, I mean, Liz Truss keeps sort of digging in and saying, I'm going to stick with this disastrous program because it'll start to bear fruit in 2 years. And things will get a lot better. And, we don't have 2 years. And in the meantime, I do think that, the situation is probably going to get worse and worse there. And, how easily can they recover from it depends on how deep they go into the hole. How quickly can they come out? It's going to take a longer time if they keep pursuing this policy that on top of Brexit, I mean, it's been several years since Brexit, we've already started to see negative effects of Brexit. So. Yeah, but you're already starting to see the effects of that, and sort of this on top of it is...
Yeah, I mean, if I could slightly... I mean, there could easily be a united Ireland within the next 5 years. We don't know what's going to happen with Scotland. Britain held itself over a cliff. A normally prudent country did itself immense self-harm for various reasons that we don't have time to go into. So... yeah, I feel Britain is more marginal than Steve was saying. Through its own doing.
As Kevin Featherstone wrote the other day, when you hear Varoufakis on BBC, call the British Secretary of the Treasury, the Czech or whatever, irresponsible, you start getting very worried.
Well, we've sadly run out of time, but thank you so much. It was an honor to have you on the stage, all of you. And thank you very much for listening to this very, very interesting panel. Hopefully things won't be as bleak as they've said today, but let's see.